Day 147 to 1:12 a.m., Mountain Sanctuary, Katandwanas. When the Diwata called unto some spirits and elementals, Mark did not expect the ones that stepped out. There were 4 people, 3 spirits and 1 elemental. First was the very same armored spirit before. The more Mark saw this guy, the more it felt that it was out of place. It was the same for the second one, another existence that was out of place. It was a woman wearing a white dress. Her appearance resembled the white lady that was common in Philippine horror stories. However, unlike what was depicted in those stories, this woman did not look like something scary at all. The third one was actually one of those black-skinned children. Compared to the ones he saw before, however, not only this boy appeared to be more mature and had stronger magical power. And lastly, the elemental. It was just a ball of light that floated down from the branches of the spirit tree. At first glance, it might just appear like that. However, Mark could sense intelligence from this ball of light. With the arrival of the 4, the Diwata sat down in front of Mark. The armored spirit and the lady in white stood behind her while the black child stood beside her seat. The ball of light hovered over her left shoulder. Lastly, the Tamawo, Ordulk, and Mark's aunt, Jenny, took the empty seats beside the Diwata. On the other hand, the others that were present earlier dispersed, although they kept a close watch while waiting hidden in the surroundings. Without a doubt, all of them were still wary of Mark. As for those that the Diwata called, Mark was quite confused as to why these people were here. He was only asking a question, after all. Was it for protection? Finally, the Diwata began. Let's start this by proper introductions. The Diwata sternly said. I am Uriah, the Diwata of Katandwanas. Hearing her name, Mark could not help but realize why the locals call this mountain that name. After introducing herself, she then introduced the people surrounding the table one by one. The armored spirit was called Morlkal. He was a person incapable of talking. Why? Apparently, the armor was not just a form of equipment. It was his very existence. He was cursed armor that gained sentience, similar to Ignis that was on Mark's back. Still, what was a cursed medieval armor doing here? Mark wanted to ask, but now was not the best time for that. The next one was Aaliyah, the lady in white, and as Mark had thought, she was really a white lady. Though right now, more than a ghost, she was already a full-blown spirit. However, that was not the shocking part there. If you really are Jenny's nephew, then Aaliyah should be one of your ancestors. That was what Uriah said. Both Mark and Aaliyah were surprised to hear that as the two stared at each other. They held the same curiosity towards each other. Not minding the gesture of the two, Uriah continued. The black-skinned child was called Darielio. Yasa. It was the first time for Mark to hear their race. And apparently, the ability to move fast came from them. Then, the ball of light. It was called Bituan. The name meant star, although there was no way that it was one. It seemed to realize what was in Mark's mind, and it seemed to be shivering. Of course, it was angry. Now is not the time for that Bituan. Uriah sighed as she turned to Mark, and don't be rude about her name. It is a sensitive topic for her. Well, of course, it would be. Everyone probably noticed that detail. And there, Bituan started shivering again, making Uriah give out another sigh. The last person to be introduced was the Tamawo named Ordulk. Apparently, he was Jenny's suitor. Lover? Mark could not help but ask while looking at his aunt. After all, she was a married woman despite her husband being unfaithful. She also had 3 children. And no. Jenny immediately denied it with an embarrassed face. He's only a friend. Unfortunately for the guy, Mark's aunt did not fall for him, and until now, he was still pursuing her, although she saw him as nothing but a friend. Those words made Ordulk a bit dejected. However, it seemed that giving up was not in his vocabulary. Mark, however. Hey. He smirked. Ordulk's pale face could not help but go red in both embarrassment and anger. Jenny immediately tried to pacify the Tamawo. After all, she did not want her friend and nephew to fight. Can you please stop trying to rile them up on purpose? Uriah's voice started shivering. It seemed that she was also losing her temper since Mark did not seem to be paying attention at all. This is why demons are troublesome to interact with, Darielio remarked at the side, making the others agree somehow. My turn, right? Mark asked, ignoring the little guy, and to answer his question, Uriah nodded. As you heard from my aunt, I'm Mark. Then, there was silence. It was a bit late when they realized. That's it? Jenny asked. What am I supposed to say? Mark asked. It was not like he was here to be chummy with everyone or anything. He just wanted information. You can at least tell us your full name or current race as a demon, right? Uriah said. Although she was hostile to demons, she held some curiosity towards Mark. His full name should be Mark Anthony DeQuino, Jenny suddenly said. Mark could only stare. He also did not expect her to just say it all. That stare, however, made Jenny feel that she did something unnecessary. As such, he added, I already threw my full name away. I just go by Mark. He stressed out that he did not want to be called with something else. It was something that these people could not understand. To spirits and elementals, names were the root of their existence. Once they were given a name, they would not be able to throw it away like humans. In fact, even humans would be able to take control of a spirit or elementals will once they learned about their true names. Seeing that they understood what he meant, Mark decided to disclose his race. I'm a blood demon and a pureblood. That, however, made the people around both confused and surprised. It seemed that none of them knew about blood demons at all, but what surprised them was that Mark was a pureblood. Are you kidding with us? A pureblood? That's impossible. Do you think that you can trick us with a lie like that? Ordulk voiced out, and in response, Mark shrugged as he stood up. Then, he released his demon form. Everyone started to shiver. Even Uriah was not an exception. Horns, fangs, his eyes, the markings on his body, the two pairs of reddish-black wings, and the most important part, the pressure that was coming from him. Mark was not lying. He was a pureblood. It only lasted a few seconds, and Mark returned to normal, taking his seat once more. He would not release it for long in this place. He could see that a lot of the spirits and elementals could not endure the pressure from him and fell unconscious. Even the night animals and insects started fleeing in fear. How is this possible? Uriah said, could not believe it. Is it impossible? Mark asked. The reactions were quite unnatural. Humans that became demons can never be purebloods, unless. Uriah replied, contemplating deeply. Unless? Jenny asked to the side. Unless that human had a pureblood demon's bloodline. As Uriah said that, her eyes panned to Mark, Jenny, and even to Aaliyah behind her. However, humans that had a pureblood demon's bloodline could not become spirits either. That was what confused the Dewata. After all, there were two people here that came from Mark's ancestry that became spirits. Mark nodded as he heard that. He now understood why they were confused. Nonetheless, Mark knew that there were no issues here. After all, blood demons were a versatile mixed race, carrying both demon and spirit bloodlines. It was also possible that their ancestor was a blood demon and a spirit, allowing this scenario to happen. Well, Mark had no plan to explain. Blood demons was a hated race, after all. That aside, Mark decided to change the topic. I want to know why the spirits are protecting our family. Uriah turned to Mark with a cough. She lost her composure. Surely, they came here for a different topic. But before all that, Uriah turned to Bituin. She looked like she was confirming something. The ball of light then released a brighter glow for a second, making the Dewata release a confused sigh. It seems that you are not lying, she said. Is that a lie detector? Mark asked. Being treated as some sort of tool, Bituin bounced in the air angrily. Bituin's ability is to see through the intentions of people in front of her. Her glowing brightly just now indicated that you were telling the truth and had no other intention aside from asking for information. How convenient, Mark said, staring at Bituin. being treated as an item again, Bituin continued to bounce in anger. If not for Mark releasing that frightening pressure earlier, she might have charged at him already. Bituin, settle down. Araya reprimanded the ball of light, making it sulk as it floated to Aaliyah's shoulder. Releasing another helpless sigh, Araya turned to Mark. As you can see, Aaliyah and Jenny are here. That is the very reason why we are protecting your family. At first, Mark would think that it was their request or the like. However, the Dewata's expression told Mark that it was not the case and it was something deeper. I don't know if you knew about this, but not just any human can become a spirit or demon. Or else, humans would have gone extinct long ago, turning into either spirits or demons. According to the Araya, even if a human wanted to, it did not mean that they could turn into one. It was like how demons like Aswangs and Mananangals, who were half-human demons, could not increase their population that easily. Aswangs and Mananangals were not a race. Their ancestors were humans that had undergone a disease like demonification. That was why, like a disease, these demons could turn other humans into their kind. Of course, it was only possible if the criteria were fulfilled. Like humans with high compatibility with magical energy. And your family had been producing those kinds of people for a very long time now. It was already like this before we even realized that it was happening. So, your people are protecting my family, so they don't fall into the hands of demons? Mark asked. That is right. Araya nodded. Of course, we won't force them to become spirits either. Besides, not everyone that had magical compatibility could become one. In the least, we ensure that none of them join the sides of the demons until their lives ended. Araya then looked at Jenny, though Jenny's generation was quite exceptional. What do you mean? Mark asked. 5 among the 7 siblings exhibited magical compatibility. One was even born with a spiritual body. Unfortunately, he died shortly after birth because of some complications. Even we could not do anything about it. That was quite a surprise. Now that Araya mentioned it, Mark's mother and some of her siblings exhibited strange abilities. Mark's mother, Grace, had a talent for reading the future using various mediums. She even managed to successfully cast various household spells at home. On the other hand, there was his uncle, Roy, that had a weak kind of healing hands. He could relieve pain and minor illnesses with his massages. There was also his youngest aunt, Belen, that had various experiences with the unknown. And of course, Jenny, that was now a spirit. As it turned out to be, Mark becoming a blood demon was not just a pure coincidence. Day 148 to 122 a.m., Mountain Sanctuary, Katandwanas. Bloodline. It was an idiomatic way to refer a family history and ancestry and genetic heritage. It could also pertain to one's lineage. To most modern common people, the term itself was not widely used, as such, irrelevant. However, to people of the hidden side of the world, it was a very important word. After all, it could dictate the capabilities of a person. Some families had unique traits that could only be passed on to their children. To families of magicians and cultivators, it could either be a talent or a trait. In the case of Mark's family, one of Mark's ancestors might have been a pureblood that managed to escape the culling of the blood demon race. And to avoid the sight of the observer in the eyes, that ancestor lived a normal life of a human. Thus, that person might have married a normal human. However, as the partner was not turned to a blood demon, it became the start of the decline of the bloodline of blood demons. As the ancestry went further without any blood demon among the family, their blood of the blood demon race inside them became thinner and thinner. It was until it could not be recognized anymore, like how the race ended up. However, even though it was already thin, it still caused some difference compared to other humans. And the fruit of that was the members of the family like Mark, Jenny, and Aaliyah. Mark was not an exception to this rule, as before he even became a blood demon, and even before the Psi crystal found him, he was already an empath. He was also capable of controlling his adrenaline. It must be their hidden bloodline at work there. Looking at these spirits and elementals, Mark could tell that they absolutely had no idea what was going on. Nevertheless, while their goal was to prevent the demons from increasing their numbers, they still protected the family for generations. Thus, Mark decided on something. Say, if the demons here in Katandwanas are gone, are you spirits and elementals here going to continue on protecting them? Don't joke around. Instead of Araya that was being asked the question, it was Ordulk that replied. If the demons here are gone, we've been fighting them for generations, and their numbers never dwindled at all. Can you shut up? I'm not asking you, Mark said. Besides, I only asked if you. Ordulk stood up from his seat. From his display, this Tamawa was quite a feisty one. Though by what it appeared to be, his own actions were also the reason he was being thrown with rude words. Ordulk, settle down, Araya said, glaring at the enraged Tamawa. Since Araya was the leader of this place, Ordulk could only get back on his seat. However, it seemed that he was still discontented. What a narrow-minded guy, Mark remarked. I already said before, please stop riling them up, Araya said with a sigh. As for your question, the answer is yes. Even if there are no demons left here in Katandwanas, we will continue. While preventing the demons are our primary goal, we also had a promise to keep and a debt to pay. Though I hope that you won't pry about these things. Mark nodded. Although he was curious about that promise and debt, he was satisfied with the answer. By the way, since my brother had some of you guarding him, my sister should be the same. How did they fall on the hands of the other faction of the rebels? That question made Araya shrug. It's because we have rules. We can't just jump into everyone's business, especially if it only involved humans. Also, it was not like they were currently in grave danger. Of course, we will take action otherwise. I see. Mark understood their reasoning. At this time, Mark stood up. Can you lead me out? Mark said to the Dewata. Are you leaving already? Jenny also stood up and asked. I have many things to do, Aunt Jenny, Mark replied to his worried aunt. And since you guys can't do it, I'll be going to retrieve my sister from her captors. I see. Jenny smiled. It might be a short meeting, but I'm glad to see a nephew of mine seem to be doing well. Mark smiled back. What a kind aunt. At this time, Aliyah stepped forward. I will go lead him out, she said, then, I will leave it to you. Araya agreed. Leaving the shade of the spirit tree, Mark and Chaflar followed Aliyah. However, it was not just the two of them. Bituin was also here, hovering above Aliyah's right shoulder. It's a pity that you're a demon. Aliyah suddenly spoke. The way she said her words had quite an old intonation, despite using slightly modern language. Why is that? Mark asked. At Mark's reply, however, Aliyah's shoulder drooped. You're calling Jenny, aunt, but nothing for me, huh? This made Mark scratch his head. Although they had not met for a long time, Mark knew that Jenny was his aunt from his memories. On the other hand, while Aliyah was supposed to be a long-lost relative, it was the first time Mark met her to call her any name. Besides, what should he call her? Great to the nth power grandmother? There was no way for him to know which generation she belonged to. By her behavior, it was also possible that she even lived way before Spanish colonial times. However, Mark could tell that Aliyah was just being lonely. Being a spirit, her loved ones had been long gone, and none of her current descendants knew about her. Only Jenny was present here too. Guarding her descendants without being able to interact with them, she would definitely be lonely. And Mark thought that it would not take much to grant a little request from her. Then, should I call you grandmother? Mark asked. Normally, being called grandmother would receive ire, especially if the woman looked young. In fact, Mark looked older compared to her in terms of both appearance and behavior. However, hearing Mark calling her grandmother, her eyes lit up. Grandmother, can you tell me now why is it a pity? Ahem. Aliyah cleared her throat. It's because if you're not a demon, you could have become a spirit like us. If you did, you could likely stay here with us. No one would accept demons here, you see. You're even the very first demon to step here as a guest. Mark could not help but sigh, hearing that. This woman was really lonely. Mark could imagine him being pampered by Aliyah as her grandchild. While it would not be bad, it would not suit him at all. I'll refrain from that, Mark replied. I have my own family that I can't leave. Huh? Aaliyah stopped walking and looked at Mark. If I remember correctly, you're Michael and Marion's older brother, right? I am. Is something wrong? Mark was confused. I heard them talking about you before when I visited them. They said that it was quite impossible for you to find a wife because you are something called a shut-in. Mark rolled his eyes. Although it was true, he wanted to punch someone. Holding in the retort he wanted to say, he replied, "That's outdated news. I already have a wife and 3 children to take care of." Mark's words jolted Aaliyah. Her eyes started to shine. Where are they? Are they with you? Will you let us meet them? What about your parents? Did they know about it? Can you bring them here next time? Aaliyah started to bombard Mark with questions like a typical grandmother that was excited about her grandchild. Mark felt troubled though. Even Bituin started to float away from the agitated woman. I won't be able to bring them here without resistance, grandmother. Mark said. Why? Aaliyah was confused. They're also of the same race as I do. Mark's reply made both Aaliyah and Bituin frozen. Did this have to do with you becoming a demon? Aaliyah asked with concern. However, Mark shook his head. It's the opposite. I'm the one that turned them. Huh? One more time. Aaliyah and Bituin froze. Are you perhaps something like a Swangs? I have never heard of blood demons before. Aaliyah's concern was getting deeper and deeper. No, blood demons are different, Mark assured the concerned woman. Rather than a disease like one that can turn humans into half-demons, we are real demons. Besides, like Elder Aswangs and Mananangals, the other party's consent is needed for me to turn them into one. We also don't crave anything and can continue living like usual. Nothing had changed aside from having abilities of a blood demon. That is quite unusual, Aaliyah said, though she understood that Mark was not lying from Bituin. A demonic race that could spread but have no side effects, it was definitely unusual. After all, the humans that became a Swang and the like would start craving for human flesh and blood. It had a heavy impact on both their manners and lives. That was why even if they did not want to, their instincts as a demon would take over and force them to hunt whenever they could. But now that Mark mentioned it, aside from a cold attitude, Mark definitely behaved no different from a human. Aaliyah could believe that Mark was saying the truth even without Bituin's help. On the other hand, Mark only shrugged. The bloodline of blood demons flowed in their veins, both Jenny and Aaliyah included. However, it was better not to disclose that information since it might cause a lot of complications. Soon, they reached the border of the sanctuary. Although the topic about blood demons made Aaliyah quite awkward, she recovered soon and started prattling at Mark about a lot of things. She even started to call Mark grandson halfway. Mark listened to her all the way. This lonely ancestor of his was definitely blowing off her loneliness this way, and there was no harm done. Was this how it was like to have a good grandmother? That was what Mark had in his mind. After all, his grandparents that he met so far left bad impressions on him, both on his mother's and father's sides. That was why it was the first time that Mark felt a grandparent wanting to pamper him. It was not a bad feeling, although he did not have time to enjoy it. Ha! Aaliyah sighed. I can only bring you here, grandson. From her expression, it was obvious that she wanted to spend more time with Mark. No, it's fine already. Mark smiled. A genuine smile. By the way, grandmother, do you know where the demons here in Katandwanas are lurking? Where they are lurking? Aaliyah tapped her chin. From what I heard recently, they moved at the southeast edge of the island. They had been capturing humans that went there under the guise of evolved animals. I see. Mark nodded, taking note of it. Why did you ask? I just want to know so I can avoid that area, Mark replied. I see. She smiled. Then, you better be careful. Suddenly, Mark was embraced. He could not help but froze a bit. Visit again soon. Next time, bring your family. I'll try to convince the others to let them in. It was kind of awkward for Mark. However, he could also feel the warmth from her. "I'll try to visit again, grandmother," he said as Aaliyah let go. From there, Mark stepped out of the border, turning the surroundings hazy. The moment his sight turned to normal, the sanctuary was gone, and he was standing at the foot of a wide mountain. Mark could not help but sigh. If I met her when I was younger, my life would have been bright. That was what Mark felt, meeting Aaliyah. With those thoughts in mind, Mark jumped onto Chaffler's back and flew towards the west direction. Back inside the border of the sanctuary, Aaliyah stood for a bit before turning back. "Let's head back," she said with a sad smile. Surely, she was happy to meet a descendant of hers. And of course, sad to see him leave. With those emotions, Aaliyah headed back to the center of the sanctuary. She did not notice, however, was Bituin, hiding its gloomy color. Bituin definitely detected that Mark was lying when he asked about where the demons lurked here in Katandwanas. However, the ball of light did not want to ruin the atmosphere and tried to hide it. It was suspicious of Mark as to why he would lie there. Day 148 to 2:34 a.m. North Kodan Coast, Kodan, San Andres, Katandwanas. Back at the camp, the little girls had already fallen asleep. Not inside their tent, though, but inside Mark and May's tent. It included Emika that did not want to sleep alone inside their tent. Emihan was also here, sleeping on an extra pillow. Edsel and Pearl also slept inside their tent. Their sleep was not too deep, and they would readily wake up when needed. As usual, Pephile stayed on guard right away after he returned. Barak was also awake. It was not like he did not want to sleep, but he was still digesting all the things that happened. Mark defeated Barak overwhelmingly. He also knew that Mark was strong. Still, there were things that he did not expect that happened earlier. Aside from his occurring thoughts, there was another thing that kept Barak awake. It was the sharp attributed energy that was gathering in the surroundings, centered around Mark and May's tent. Inside the tent, May was still awake. It was her habit, every time that Mark was away. Except for this time, however. While watching over the sleeping girls, she started to practice the basic cultivation technique Mark taught her. The event earlier gave her a bit of a sense of urgency. After all, the infected were growing fierce by the day. And at this point, practicing Chinese cultivation would help her a lot. Of course, she did not want to be a cultivator, but no one would be able to deny that even the basics of it could enhance a person's body. Nevertheless, her main goal for this was to keep standing beside Mark and not drag him behind. The waiting took a while after Mark took away his unconscious brother and the members of the rebels they caught. But then, before the sound of Chaffler's flapping wings reached them, May had already stopped her meditation and rushed outside. Barak was confused by that gesture. He could not help but look at May as she stared in a specific direction. And soon, he realized what she was doing when he vaguely saw the dragon's silhouette in the northern sky. He could not help but turn back to May in both confusion and surprise. "You don't have to be surprised," Pephile said to Barak. For some strange reason, her ability to perceive her husband is absurdly high. As Mark and Chafflar landed, everyone woke up, well, except Emika and Emihan. As usual, May and the little girls welcomed Mark back. Well, May was looking at Mark strangely, though. Before Mark could ask her what was wrong, she started sniffing him. There was no need for him to ask now. He had seen such gesture from a lot of anime to be unable to understand what was going on. "Smells like flowers, doesn't it?" Mark said with a bitter smile as he pulled May into his embrace. "Who?" May asked, staring at Mark's eyes. This situation made Mark shrug. "Let's sit down first," Mark said. There, they sat around the campfire as Mark told everyone what happened. Of course, while he told them about his family producing magically inclined people, he left out the actual circumstances behind his lineage. "What an odd family you have," Pephile said while the others could not help but agree. Even Barak was the same. Mark was a demon, and now, his aunt and grandmother from an unknown generation got revealed that they became spirits. Their circumstance was very complicated. Looking at May, Mark ruffled her head. So, don't get jealous, all right? May replied with a red face. It just didn't smell like a human, so. Mark could only smile bitterly. May would not react if it were a human, but it was the opposite if it was not. Pretty much like when Snow was targeting him in New Jersey as a mate. By the way, grandmother wants to meet you and the girls next time. Mark said. Meet your grandmother? May asked. Yeah, she seems excited to meet my wife and children, you see. Hearing Mark's words made May even redder and nervous. I don't mind, May said, twiddling with her index fingers. What a cute reaction. Still, Mark could not help but look at someone. It was Abigail. What's wrong with her? Even Pephile noticed it. Abigail was shaking. The calm Abigail seemed to be afraid of something. Mark could only shake his head as he stood and picked her up. He then came back to his seat, letting the scared girl sit down on his lap. The little girl could only curl up in the body of the person she recognized as her father, trying to regain her calm. May and the others could only watch in concern. Even Miracle, who would always compete with her sister for that position, remained quiet. Don't worry, Gail. She's a very kind grandmother, all right? Mark whispered to the girl. Slowly, Abigail raised her head and looked at Mark's face. She won't hit me. No, she won't, Mark replied, caressing her head hair. That exchange gave Pephile and the others the idea of what was going on. Boss. Edsel called out. Does her real grandmother? Edsel could not finish his question, though, looking at Abigail that would shiver just by hearing the word. Everyone here knew that none of the girls was Mark's actual daughter. Even the new member, Barack, was not a fool to not realize it. Looking at May, who did not seem to be past 20, there was no way that she would have Viola as her daughter unless she gave birth as a child less than 10 years of age. Mark continued caressing the girl's head gently as he recalled the story. It was a circumstance that none of them tried to dig up in front of Abigail. And as everyone could tell from the little girl's question, she was indeed abused by her grandmother. Of course, this information did not only come from Abigail but also her blood-related aunt, Jaya. From the start, it was one of the things that Abigail said to Mark. She did not have a father, and that was one of the reasons she wholeheartedly cherished Mark. Abigail came from a rich family. A family that Jaya's mother, Isolda de los Reyes, raised from the dirt on her own after their father left them for another woman. Although her husband leaving led Isolda to become a strong woman, she also became an extremely strict mother to her 2 daughters. It ended up with Isolda dictating her daughters about things. About what they should do and should not. Even to the point of matchmaking her daughters to men that she approved of. Sons of rich people in her field of business. But as if destiny dictated, her first daughter, Ika, got pregnant with an unknown man as a father. What was worse was that the man actually ran away after knowing about Ika's pregnancy. As such, Isolda was infuriated. She urged her daughter to abort the child. However, Ika begged to keep the child. In exchange, she would follow her mother's words from then on. In the end, Ika managed to make Isolda agree. But of course, it did not mean that the grandmother accepted her bastard of a grandchild. The child was born. Of course, it was Abigail. And as it seemed, whenever there was a mishap, like Abigail behaving the child of her age, accidentally knocking off things, she would get unreasonably scolded, or worse, hit. The worst was the words that Isolda would hurl towards the child that was inappropriate for her age. At an early age, Abigail knew that her supposed father left her and ran away. It was because he did not want Abigail. Ika knew what was going on. However, the only thing she could do was to endure and take care of Abigail as much as she could. She had thoughts of running away with the little girl. However, there was nowhere they could go. Even their relatives hated her mother and no one would definitely accept them. What added to the fire was when Jaya ran away from home, eloping with a man. Isolda became more distraught that Ika could not take away her eyes from her daughter. If not, Abigail would receive all the brunt of her grandmother's anger. And thus, while Ika was not home, Abigail could only stay inside their room. And then, The event came. The expensive ragdoll cat that Isolde was raising sneaked into Abigail's bedroom. As Abigail knew that it was her grandmother's, she was afraid of going near it. As such, she tried to chase it out. However, like its grumpy owner, the cat was as hateful. It started to rampage inside the room, knocking off a lot of things in the process. In desperation to get the cat out of the room, the little girl grabbed it after it was cornered. However, it resisted, and in the end, Abigail got bitten. It all happened while Ika was not home, as she needed to attend to their business. That bite caused one of the cat's fangs to be broken, and of course, Abigail got hit for that. Due to implications in the business, Ika went home the next morning, only to find their room had become a mess and Abigail was burning with fever due to the bite. The mother immediately rushed her daughter out, going to the hospital. That was when the outbreak struck. With the little girl's experiences, it was no wonder that the word grandmother struck her negatively. To her, it was far scarier than the infected. As Mark told everyone the story, they could not help but look at Abigail with complicated expressions. By this time, the little cat girl had already fallen asleep, curled in the embrace of the father she recognized. "You really have a pretty complicated family, don't you?" Pephile remarked. "You're the last person I want to hear that from." Mark retorted to everyone's confusion. After all, aside from Mark, no one here knew about this Tamuo's circumstances. Ahem. Pephile coughed. "What is your next plan, now?" Mark thought for a bit and nodded as the idea entered his mind. "I want to clean this island," Mark declared. "What do you mean?" Barak could not help but ask. "I already confirmed that my family is in a good situation. The only thing left was to make their environment safer." "You don't intend to wipe out the infected and evolved animals on the island, do you?" Pephile asked. "That one is impossible, of course," Mark replied. "Unless we flatten the whole island, we won't be able to do that." "But it didn't mean that we can't do anything about other things," Mark added. "The rebels and the demons," May spoke. "That's right. The neutral and peaceful factions of the rebels aside, the aggressive ones and the demons don't need to exist on this island anymore." As Mark said that, Barak could not help but feel chills on his back. Without a doubt, Mark was planning to conduct a massacre on this island. Furthermore, there would be no discrimination between humans and non-humans. Even though Mark and his family were demons themselves, they would not hesitate to eliminate other demon races. "You care a lot for someone who did not want to meet his family," Pephile said. "Isn't that being a hypocrite?" "You really have a sharp tongue, seriously." Mark shrugged. "But you are wrong about something. I might have some disputes with them, but they are still my family. It's not like I care, but they are still a responsibility I have to fulfill. I don't intend to take them in or directly help them. At least, they can't say that I did nothing for them." Pephile shrugged back. Mark's line of thought was very hard to understand. "Are we moving immediately?" May asked. "Tomorrow." Mark nodded. "We will spend a day to clean this island and then move on." Day 148 to 7:01 a.m. Northeast Gate, Katandwana's Circumferential Road, Katandwana's Military Settlement, Kodon, San Andres, Katandwanas. The sun had risen in the east. It was another day in the apocalypse. This time, people were gathered at the northeast gate of the Katandwana's settlement. While most of them were soldiers, there were also a lot of bystanders. As usual, they were there to just watch what was going on. After all, they were curious about why the general was here in the first place. Of course, the soldiers tried to drive these people away. However, it was not like use force and could only keep them some distance away. Even though General Padilla, Vanessa, Andrew, and the rest of their entourage were here, none of them were the center of attraction. It was the two young soldiers talking with the group. As the gallery knew that these two soldiers were not usually seen around the general, they took the people's attention. Some were just curious, but some had other goals for remembering their faces. The two were no other than Ernest Geronimo and Jules Padua. They were the two privates that were detained due to the ill will of Captain Zachariah in Caramoan Feeder Port. They were already freed as the investigation deemed them as the victims. Furthermore, the soldier that Private Padua shot had already confessed what happened. However, the two did not have any reason to continue being soldiers anymore. To say, the general and the higher-ups of the military in this settlement were too late to take action. The damage had already been done because of the holes in their management. As such, they lost two promising young soldiers in their camp. General Padilla talked to the two young soldiers with pity. The more he interacted with the two, the more he saw how decent they were even compared to some veterans in their field. Unfortunately, they were too late, and Mark got the full allegiance of the two. "General, are we really letting go of these two?" Vanessa, the general's secretary, asked. She had been in this field for a long time and could see the same thing as the general about the two. The two might need some nurturing, but they were definitely good seeds. That Mark had already beaten us to the punch. The general sighed. If not for Segura, we could have gotten rid of that Zacharias soon. That pig brought us more damage than help. That was right. Zachariah was one of General Segura's direct subordinates. In fact, after the death of the Marines general, they learned from his subordinates that his appearance at the beach yesterday was not just because of the report of the monster. Since the night before, even before General Padilla knew, General Segura already knew about the arrival of Mark's group and the package they were carrying. That was why it was totally odd that General Segura arrived too fast at that time. Aside from his brother's situation, one of his goals was to capture Mark's group and take the package away from them. Unfortunately for the Marines general, his greediness horribly backfired. As the crimes had gone to light, they actually wanted to recall Captain Zachariah and capture him by surprise. Well, that was if they could still do it. However, the military could not and would not be able to do it in the future. It was because the military camp at the Caramoan feeder port no longer existed as of last night. The reason was not hard to assume. After all, everyone in the settlement knew the threat that appeared last night. All communications to the military camp was gone, and all the soldiers there were declared Mia. The last radio exchange they had was them reporting a large-scale attack at the camp. It was very likely that a lot of the infected that attacked the military settlement last night passed by that area. 10 minutes after everyone was gathered here, the people they were waiting for finally appeared. A lot of people were shocked. Some even tried to run away. After all, who would not be afraid to see a huge winged lizard flying towards the settlement's gates? Some of the soldiers also flinched and moved into battle positions. However, they saw General Padilla signal them to be at ease. That was when they saw people riding on the dragon's back. Without attacking anyone, the dragon landed outside the gates. The two young soldiers were surprised at the spectacle. Even more when they saw Mark jump off the back of Chaflar. General Padilla approached Mark, beckoning the two young soldiers to follow him. "You guys are pretty early. I won't be surprised if you guys came here a few hours later. I didn't set any exact time, after all," Mark said as the general's group approached. Some were confused why Mark said that. There were also those who frowned. As for the general, he could only sigh. Ignoring Mark's sarcastic remark, the general replied, "We decided at this time since it's not too early but not too late in the morning." The general then made the two soldiers step forward. "As you requested, we brought these two." The two soldiers looked at each other and nodded. They then made their way towards Mark. "Boss, you really came for us, huh?" Padua said to Mark, rubbing his nose. "Dude, be respectful. He's our boss now," Geronimo reprimanded his friend. "It's fine," Mark said to Geronimo. "I don't mind how you speak as long as you two behaved properly." "See, it's fine." Padua nudged his friend, who could only let a troubled sigh. Ignoring the antics of the two, Mark turned back to the general. "Then, I'll be taking away these two." "It's fine," the general nodded. They also requested to leave already. "As I said before, we are not going to force anyone to stay." Of course, the general did not make any effort to hide his pity from the loss of some good seeds. "Though to say, I'm quite dissatisfied. I don't think that it's enough of a reward for helping us last night," the general said. After all, he would allow the two soldiers to leave the military if they did not want to continue. Because of this, even though they fulfilled Mark's request, it still felt that they owed him. At this point, Mark smiled, an eerily uncomfortable smile. Then, General, Mark spoke. Actually, there is something else. I'm listening. The general replied, unsettled by that smile. I want to ask about the person in charge of the evacuation in Barros. Everyone heard Mark's request and felt that something was wrong. I heard something. It seems that whoever that was, he tried to hit on a woman and chased away the people with her when she rejected his invitation. Mark added. The general could not help but frown. He heard about this situation. However, it was buried in the mud because of the need to rush on securing the settlement. It was totally unexpected for it to be dug up at this point in time. General Padilla had already opened his mouth to ask what was the matter. However, before he could do so, Mark was already gone. Ack! A loud painful choking was heard, turning everyone to the source of the sound. They were shocked to see Mark, who was already choking the officer that was leading the crowd control with his right hand. How convenient. I thought I have to search the whole settlement. Unexpectedly, you are here. Nice. Mark said in a chilling tone. Mark, what is going on? The general quickly asked. He was in a bit of panic. Mark was giving out thick killing intent. He could tell. And as far as the general knew, this was bad news. Mark then turned to the general, not minding the flailing officer as he started to lack oxygen. Even though it was obvious that the officer was trying to break free and grab Mark, for some reason, he could not, and his movements were strangely stiff. I won't hide it since several groups sent people to tail us yesterday. You all probably noticed that I was looking for something. I'm looking for my family, Mark confessed. Then, the general tried to interrupt. You don't have to say anything, General. They're not here. I bet you can deduce it from what I said earlier. Mark said. The general and the other soldiers could only freeze as the situation sunk into their minds. Mark just said about that event that happened during the evacuation in Barros, Catanduanes. They were not dumb to not know what was going on. That woman this guy tried to hit on. That's my sister, you see. Mark declared. This guy chased away my parents, siblings, and relatives. General, I'm kind of disappointed, Mark said, staring at the officer's insignia on his uniform. Master Sergeant. Huh? Why is this kind of garbage still in this position? The general could not say anything to that. Even though he reasons was because there was a lot of more urgent situations to do in the settlement, it was a fact that he also neglected a lot of things. Who would have thought that it would backfire today? Mark glanced at the general before turning back to the officer that was already turning purple on his hand. Do you want to say anything? Mark asked, loosening the grip of his hand. FCKU. The officer spat on Mark's face to everyone's horror. He already knew that he was going to die. He was there when the soldiers under General Segura were killed yesterday. Thus, he knew that Mark was a person that would not hesitate to kill. Ack. The officer tried to let out more curses only to start choking again. Mark then swiped the saliva on his left cheek with his free left arm. Initially, I thought of giving you a quick death, but it looks like you're more stupid than I thought. Then, the officer's eyes dilated in horror. He could feel that something pierced his neck, entered his body, and was now flowing all over it. Slowly, his body became stiffer and stiffer. Without his control, his lives began to stretch out. It was until he could not move anything else aside from his neck and above. He also felt weak, as if his body did not have enough blood circulating anymore. The worst part, it was painful as hell. He was screaming in agony, but almost no voice could be heard because Mark was choking him hard. Everyone watching could not understand what was happening. They could only see the officer struggle as his limbs behaved as if he was having seizures. The soldiers were concerned about what they were seeing. After all, the officer was still a soldier, one of their comrades. However, none of them wanted to be a hero and rescue the officer. Even the general had no such notion. And then, Mark opened his hand, letting go of the officer, and like a metal stick that was dropped on the ground vertically, The officer fell with his body frozen like a statue. Cough. Cough. Aghhh, the officer coughed hard, only to cause him more pain as he screamed. His body seemed to be frozen stiff with only his head capable of moving. Everyone could not imagine what happened to the officer and what kind of agony he was going through. At this time, Mark turned to the general. "General, you still felt indebted to me, right? Then, I have a good request." "What is it? Do you need us to find your family?" the general asked. "Find them?" Mark smiled. "Don't bother, they're all dead already." Everyone's hearts started pounding loudly. They could not help but curse inside their minds as their eyes fell on the suffering officer. "What I want you to do is to keep this guy alive," Mark ordered. "What? Of course," the general was flabbergasted, but Mark did not care. "I don't care how you guys do it. Just leave him as is or put him on life support or something. Just keep this guy alive as long as possible. If you think that it will waste food and water, then you can feed him dirt or infected meat and make him drink piss. I don't care as long as he's alive." "I believe you can do that, right?" Mark said as he turned away, walking back to Chaflar. "Let's go," Mark said to the two young soldiers. The two looked at each other once more, seemingly hesitating. In the end, the two made another voiceless agreement as he steeled themselves and hurriedly followed Mark. And there, under everyone's watch, Mark left, taking the two young soldiers with him as they rode on the dragon's back. Day 148 to 7:45 a.m. Military Base, Catanduanes Military Settlement, Codon, San Andres, Catanduanes. Inside the military base, the soldiers off duty from their shifts gathered around the infirmary instead of resting. It could not be helped as something absurd was going on. Many of them witnessed as Master Sergeant Lucerio Bayola was being transported to the infirmary while screaming in agonizing pain. All those that heard his cries shivered as goosebumps enveloped their bodies. It was a scream of a person that wanted to die but could not. While being transported in a stretcher, the Master Sergeant was as stiff as a mannequin, with only his head seemed to be capable of moving. Due to the pain that he was feeling, his eyes were already red with tears that seemed to be slightly red because of blood. His nose was overflowing with bloody snot as that only the medics would dare wipe off. In the end, doctors decided to administer general anesthesia because of an unexpected action from the officer. Extreme pain was known to lead anyone to make unnecessary actions. In more usual cases, it would cause a person to grab the source of pain while rolling in the ground, instinctually trying to relieve the pain. And in cases where the person could not move, it might lead to more absurd actions. While wailing in pain, Master Sergeant Bayola forced to move his arm. The soldiers managed to stop him. However, it still caused his arm to rupture a bit, letting metal that solidified in his veins protruding out of his skin. His blood, of course, splattered, leading the doctors to scramble to stop the bleeding. Soon, while the doctors were taking care of the officer, General Padilla, who seemed to have quite a headache, arrived with few of his usual assistants. "Has the bleeding stabilized?" the general asked the head doctor after hearing what happened. "We managed by reducing the blood pressure on his arm. If possible, we wanted to do an operation, however." The doctor did not finish his sentence and only looked at the protruding metals on the unconscious officer's arm. This metal substance seemed to be embedded in the blood vessels in his entire body. The only exceptions are the major arteries near the heart and his head. The doctor whipped out some X-ray sheets, showing the eerily clustered metallic substance occupying half of the officer's bloodstream. The metal is also unexpectedly hard. "We tried to cut it with a bone saw, but we only managed to take off this little piece." The doctor then placed a sealed plastic bag on the table. It contained a grain of salt-sized metal fragment. "I recommend analyzing this metal fragment if we want to save him." But then, to the doctor's surprise, the general shook his head. "He is not brought here to be saved. Just keeping him alive is enough. Just make sure to stop the bleeding and constrain him so that it would not happen in the future." The doctor hesitated as he confronted General Padilla. "General, I heard about the situation. Are we really going to do this inhuman thing? If there's no saving him, isn't it better to euthanize him? I know that. The general replied. Leaving Bayola in that state could also cause repercussions in terms of trust and welfare among our soldiers. However, there's nothing we can do. He offended someone that he should not have. Is that courier that frightening, General? The doctor asked, seemingly privy of some circumstances in the settlement. It's not undisclosed to the public yet, but that very same courier you mentioned is the one that saved us from the infected last night. At first, I did not exactly believe the letters from Faustino. However, the events yesterday afternoon and last night led us to believe it. The general then let out a deep sigh. It is better to assume that his group might have the ability to wipe out this settlement off the face of Earth. Between the life of an immoral soldier and the populace, you already knew what to choose, right? That is why you should not ask or do anything unnecessary. Just keep Bayola alive as much as possible. The general added. Yes, General. The doctor nodded. It might be heavy in his heart to see a patient suffering like hell, but there was nothing they would be able to do in the face of a far greater threat. **************************** Day 148 to 8:05 a.m. Mount Obi, Karamoran, Katandwanas. Flying over the forest-covered mountain of Obi in Karamoran, the two young soldiers smoothly integrated into the group. Unlike Barak, who was mostly silent because he was afraid of Mark, the two were more outgoing. Of course, they felt goosebumps due to the punishment that Mark gave that officer. But considering the reason, they really could not blame Mark. But then, the truth came to light soon enough. It's really amazing how you can lie straight-faced, like that, Pephile remarked. But it's a very clever move to declare that your family is already dead. Wait, boss. Padua immediately asked. Your family is still alive? Dude, of course. Geronimo started jabbing his friend with his elbow to stop him from asking. It's fine, Mark said to the two before turning to Pephile. It's better that way, right? Declaring them dead is a good way of protecting them. There are a lot of rats in that settlement, after all. By confessing what he was looking for at the settlement, he answered the suspicions of the people tailing them at that time. Then, telling them all what happened, declaring that his family had already passed on, and punishing the culprit with something worse than death would force everyone to go to conclusions that he expected them to. If he did not confess that he was looking for his family, some smart brains might start investigating it, and it could lead to his family being found by unnecessary people. The military trying to make a connection with them was one thing, but the other rats might instead try to capture them and use his family to tie him up. Mark did not want that to happen. At this time, Mark then looked at the two young soldiers. It was when the two soldiers could only open their mouths in shock and amazement as Mark opened a black hole in front of him and took out two M16 machine guns and several ammunition cases. You two divide these. Mark said to the two. Aside from their things, the only weapon the two currently had were pistols. Their other military equipment had to be surrendered after they were relieved from their duties. Of course, they had credits in the settlement that could be exchanged for other things since they were soldiers. However, deciding to follow Mark meant leaving the settlement from the start. The credits they had in this settlement would be rendered useless. They could have exchanged the credits for weapons, but Mark already told them not to when he invited them. Instead, after exchanging for some necessities, the two transferred their remaining credits to their close friends in the army who had families to feed. Now, they knew why Mark told them that, but still, there was one thing that confused the two. Why did Mark give them weapons at this moment? Not minding their reactions, Mark spoke. I need you two to prepare. We are going to storm the rebels' camp soon. Huh? Of course, the two were shocked even more. You two don't have to be surprised like that, but boss. Padua voiced out, stuttering. Even though he was a courageous person, it would be hard to find the courage to storm an enemy's base with just a few people. Beside Padua, Geronimo could only stare at Mark, not knowing what to say. Don't worry. Mark shrugged. It won't be that dangerous. ****************************** Day 148 to 12:11 p.m. San Pedro Poblacion, Municipality of Viga, Catanduanes. The sun was already high up in the sky. Most of the rebels were amidst their lunch break. At a warehouse in the factory area, the workers were lining up, getting their barely filling ration. A bowl of watered-down soup as a side dish for a half cup of rice was not really that bad, though. In the least, they were being fed. It was the regular daily occurrence here, though this time, there was an unusually sad atmosphere among some workers. They were those whose relatives and friends went missing last night during that suicide mission. Among them was a short but quite boyish woman. She was slowly eating her food with a dull expression. "Marion, don't be sad. Your brother is just missing. There's a chance that he's still alive," another woman sitting beside Marion said, rubbing the latter's back to comfort her. "That's easy to say," Marion replied. "With how things on Earth are right now, the percentage of surviving is much lower than dying. If someone went missing, it's more reasonable to think for the worse than have false hope." The women sitting with Marion at the same table could only smile bitterly. They wanted to cheer her up, but it seemed to have backfired. "Come on, don't be like that," another woman chimed in. "We are just worried about you." A lot of people's true colors were revealed during the hard times. While some would end up with the worst, the opposite was also the same. People suffering the same fate without any other way out could bond easier, sometimes leading to good friendships. But of course, it was hard to determine which one was true and which was false. Drowning under the uncomfortable atmosphere, everyone continued to eat with bitter faces. They had to finish as soon as they could since their time for lunch was limited. But then, a strange event happened. Someone entered the warehouse. At first, only a few people facing the wide open door noticed the person. Then, the ones that saw how the first ones reacted followed suit. It only took a few seconds, and everyone's attention was already on that person. Why? The person was wearing a sinister-looking mask, paired with a similarly-looking armor. No one recognized that person, especially that appearance. At first, the workers thought that the person was among the rebels with quite a hobby. But then, the guards that were keeping their eyes on the workers readied their weapons and approached the masked person. As it appeared, even the rebels did not recognize the person. "Who are you?" one of the rebels aggressively asked, pointing his gun at the armored person. This rebel was the person in charge of the workers. As such, he was privy to things around the base. And, of course, there was no information or notification about this armored person. Furthermore, unauthorized entry was not allowed in the factory area. Only the members that were stationed here were allowed to enter. It was to secure the supplies and other important things to be properly monitored. That was why the arrival of this armored person was extremely suspicious. But then, ignoring the armed man in front of him, the armored person turned his head towards a specific direction. "Looks like she's fine," the armored man could be heard. Of course, being ignored like that left an extremely bad taste to the rebels. As such, the person in charge exerted more pressure on his voice. "I'm asking a question here, WHO, the FCK. Are you deaf?" The rebel then started poking the armored person with the muzzle of his gun. "And what the F***CK is this appearance? Did you go to a children's party?" The rebels started laughing like hooligans. Sure enough, they found it funny, thinking that the armor was just some sort of costume. But then, the laughter was cut short. The armored man waved his hand. Everyone watching was confused as to why the rebels suddenly went silent. It was until their bodies fell with their heads separated. The chilling sensation enveloped the bodies of the workers. As most of them were weak-hearted women, this scene made many of them scream in fear. Inside the warehouse, chaos began. Well, that should have been the next events that happened. However, it did not, as everyone froze in their tracks, unable to move with their shaking legs. Day 148 to 12:15 p.m. Warehouse, factory area, rebel base, San Pedro Poblacion, Municipality of Viga, Catanduanes. Like mannequins, everyone inside the warehouse was frozen stiff. There was no distinction whether they were the rebels or the forced workers. All of them were under the frightening effect of Mark's emphatic ability. even his sister included. Of course, unlike the others, he controlled the effect on Marion. Nevertheless, it did not remove the fact that it was a frightening situation similar to everyone experiencing sleep paralysis at the same time. But Mark did not care. Shaking, they could only watch as Mark started walking around the warehouse. The first he approached was another group of rebels at the corner tasked to guard the workers. Of course, they were panicking. They wanted to flee, but their bodies refused to move. There were those with a stronger will. However, the only movement they could make was to fall flat on the floor. Mark waved his right hand. Those that still stood fell with their heads rolling away and blood creating a pool on the floor. Mark then looked down and waved his hand a few more times. The rebels that fell to the floor in resistance followed the demise of their comrades. They died with eyes opened wide, unable to voice out their horror. Sure enough, their voiceless deaths stirred up everyone present. They started to believe that Mark was not a human but a monster. Nonetheless, some thought otherwise. After all, Mark was walking past the panicked women. He was only aiming at the rebels that were supposed to keep an eye on them. But then, the confusion came as Mark raised his hand at the next group of the horrified armed men and stopped a bit before waving his hand once more. However, while most of these men fell with decapitated heads, one remained standing, shaking violently in fear. Mark stared at the man for a second before turning back. That was when the sensation on the man's body returned. He fell kneeling to the pool of blood of the killed rebels beside him. The man could only look at Mark's back without even a shred of will to raise the weapon on his hands. But then, to the surprise of everyone, a woman at a table nearby regained the ability to move. Instead of running, however, she unexpectedly rushed towards the man spared by Mark. Fearing for their lives, the two could only embrace each other. It was clear that they had an intimate relationship. If you two want to live, don't move from that spot. The people around heard Mark spoke to the two. Of course, there was no response aside from their confused stare with eyes filled with fear. But even so, the two did not want to die. Thus, they could only stay put, even if they were kneeling on the blood of the dead rebels. Ignoring the two, Mark made his way toward the last group of rebels in the warehouse. It was the group guarding the workers in charge of cooking and distributing lunch. And, of course, they all died without resistance. Now, aside from the spared man, the only ones remaining in the warehouse were all women. After all, it was the area where the captured women were all forced to work. As for the men, those that were capable got forced into the ranks of the rebels. On the other hand, the ones incapable of fighting got sent to the field for farming. Thus, none of them were here. After clearing the warehouse of rebels, Mark spoke out loud. I'll let all of you move now, stay put, and don't make a ruckus, though I don't mind if any of you want to follow these guys. As Mark said his threat, he kicked a severed head into the air like a soccer ball, splattering blood at the trajectory it traveled. And to the horror of some, the blood fell on their bodies. URPH. Some of the women could not help but feel nauseous, getting her face splattered with blood. It was not surprising since some of them here were not used to such gore. They wanted to vomit out the food they had just eaten. However, the fear of Mark forced them to hold it in. Mark monitored everyone's emotions. Knowing that they decided to stay put, he released his coercion, allowing these women to regain their movements. What are you going to do with us? A courageous woman asked Mark. Don't worry, Mark replied. I'm only here for the rebels. After this, you are all free to go wherever you wanted. When Mark said that, it immediately exploded into a commotion. Mark then tilted his head threateningly, causing a sudden silence to envelop the warehouse. This silence should have allowed Mark to speak more. But then, bam! The metal wall of the warehouse was punctured by a sniper bullet. At the same moment, Mark swiftly moved his right arm, making his right hand block his temple. Clang! Mark's armored hand closed and shook violently with a loud metallic sound. The women panicked. It was obvious that Mark was shot at. It was when Mark opened his hand, letting a flattened tip of a sniper bullet fall to the floor. Damn it, My hand hurts, Mark said, shaking his hand because of the pain. Looks like they had some experts, huh? Mark turned his head, looking at the punctured metal wall near the entrance of the warehouse. ****** In the watchtower at the walls, a man equipped with a sniper rifle could not believe what he had just seen. He was a mutator with thermal vision. Furthermore, his sight could pass through thin metal walls like the ones used to build the warehouse. Although the sun could affect his eyesight, it was still usable as the temperature in the surroundings was cooler even during noon. As such, he could see what just happened clearly. "Jules, what happened? Did you kill the intruder?" Another man asked the frozen sniper. "Shit. No. The bastard caught the bullet with his hand," the sniper hurriedly said as he snapped back to reality. "Quick! Report to the others that we are not dealing with just some intruder right now. I will go ring the bell." "Good," the other man replied without question. Well, that was his last word, though. Pang! Before the man could jump off the watchtower, his head was blown off. What the F? Jules' eyes turned wide as he saw his comrade's body fall in front of him. He cursed as he tried to duck. Unfortunately for him, it was too late. A bullet pierced through the wall of the watchtower and hit him. The bullet punctured his lungs and liver, indicated that the shot came from higher ground. Back at the warehouse, everyone was silent. Looks like they're dealt with. Mark shrugged. But the others were already alerted. Huh. Do they have someone with abilities like Huey, I wonder? Mark was murmuring as he detected a large number of rebels started to surround the warehouse. All over the rebels' base, the watchtower bells were all ringing violently. These rebels were a proper organization. The rings of their bells indicated a message. Usually, they had rhythmic ones indicating incoming infected or military. The violent ringing, however, indicated urgent emergencies like the base being infiltrated. It was not the first time that this happened. As such, the rebels were quite fast to respond. Most of them ran to a designated place to learn the situation before rushing to the area where the intruder was located. Because of this system, although most of them did not arrive at the scene together, they gathered fast. In hindsight, a large number of the rebels gathering at one place might sound overkill. However, since the last one was actually a mutated animal that was hard to kill, it could not be helped. Right now, about half of the armed forces of the rebels were already gathered outside the warehouse. They were being led by their combat commander, Renz. The intruder inside. Go out of the warehouse and surrender, or else. We will shower the warehouse with bullets. Renz shouted using a megaphone. Normally, they would not do this kind of threat. It was because the ones that infiltrated them so far were mutated, tricky and mindless creatures. But now, it was clear that the intruder was sentient. From what they knew, the workers inside were still alive. Are you sure that the workers are still alive? Renz turned off the megaphone and asked the man beside him. Aside from one, our men inside the warehouse are all dead. All the workers we captured is all fine. The man closed his eyes, sensing the situation inside the warehouse as he replied. Tisk. Renz clicked his tongue. It could have been easier if those are dead. If the workers were already dead, they could just storm the warehouse and riddle the intruder with bullets. However, the workers were still alive. If they just shot their guns recklessly and killed the workers in the process, their leader with her stupid virtues would definitely skin them alive. Renz hated that woman to the bones. However, it was not worth it to confront her over some worthless people. It was not the right time, either. Suddenly, a commotion started among the rebels. It was because the intruder actually went out of the warehouse. That sinister appearance gave them nothing but bad news. Mark walked out of the warehouse without care. Of course, he made sure to warn the women inside to lower themselves to the floor just in case. Looking at the rebels that had their guns pointed at him, Mark smiled. Just like I wanted. It is easier to eliminate these guys if they gathered like this. Mark then stretched both his shoulders to the rebels' bewilderment. Renz saw those actions and raised his megaphone once more. Like a third-rate villain, It seemed that he was about to start a useless chatter. And Mark was not really fond of that. As such, without waiting for any words to come out the mouth of the guy with the megaphone, Mark leaned forwards. Bam! A loud sound was heard as the cement under Mark's foot cracked, and then, with a blur, Mark appeared in front of the nearest rebel. Swish! Unable to react to Mark's fast movements, a slit appeared on that rebel's neck after Mark's hand swiped at it. But that was just the start. The other rebels beside the first one followed suit. Most of the rebels froze, unable to process what just happened. It was until someone fired his gun. Unexpectedly, it was no other than Renz that had already thrown his megaphone away in irritation. "What are you F-curs doing staring like idiots? Shoot!" Renz roared as he stared, shooting Mark like a madman. The other rebels followed the order and shot Mark without hesitation. Unfortunately, for some reason that none of them could understand, all their bullets missed. They continued shooting, emptying magazine after magazine. But not a single bullet made contact with their target's body. On the other hand, the intruder had already killed more than a dozen of their comrades. *T. What the hell is this? A rebel cried out as he started retreating. Mark was already close to his position, and he could feel death looming over him as he entered Mark's line of sight. In the end, he could not help but abandon his position and run away like a chicken. However, it was late. One thing that a person should not do was to turn his back to the enemy. That rebel could only gape his mouth as he lost the sensation of his body. That was when he realized that he was now nothing but a dying head that was about to roll to the ground. Finally, the rebels realized that their guns were useless. Some started to abandon their weapons and transformed while the others made their retreat. These rebels sure had some organized way of dealing with enemies, huh? Mark smiled under his mask as he saw the mutators of the rebels charge at him. Day 147 to 12:21 p.m. Factory area, Rebel Base, San Pedro Poblacion, Municipality of Vega, Catanduanes. It might be a bit late because of Mark's fast movements. However, even without instructions, the armed rebels that were not mutators already moved out of the way. It was for them not to drag the mutators as they fought the threat. This voluntary act of the rebels proved both their competence and experience, and as it appeared, they had a set of actions to take at different circumstances. Mark watched the mutators charge at him with interest. Furthermore, although the mutators were already moving towards him as fast as possible, they seemed to be waiting for something. "Get into predator formation," Renz shouted at his megaphone. As it seemed, that was what they were waiting for. The armed rebels retreated further but not too far away before moving into different directions. They then hurriedly formed ranks around the area. Most of them moved into higher grounds. The whole place had scaffoldings connected by bridges everywhere, which was likely a precaution against infected attacks. On the other hand, the mutators also changed their movements. Instead of charging at Mark and started attacking, they separated, moving around Mark. Almost immediately, Mark was surrounded by the rebels in all directions. It was not hard for Mark to understand what was happening. The name Predator in this formation might be about the predator type, infected. The type of infected that would attack brutally while moving fast. It also had a tendency to retreat and commit unexpected movements and ambushes. And the best way to stop a predator type's unexpected actions was to surround it as fast as possible if it was not subdued immediately. By the looks of it, the combat commander deemed Mark similar to a predator type, and applied such actions. It was kind of funny, though, since it was clear that Mark was not an infected. This kind of tactic would only work at the infected since they were brainless for the most part. Of course, it would also work against humans since it was a tactic to overwhelm the enemy. But to Mark, he could not see how this would affect him at all. In any case, Mark stopped in place, watching the rebels with a shrug. Mark's action, however, made the rebels think that they cornered him. It was amazing that they were optimistic, but unfortunately, they were mistaken. At this time, Renz took the opportunity to speak on his megaphone. "Who the FCK are you, and why are you making trouble in our base?" Mark could not help but frown. He was a person that mostly spent time in silence. Thus, one of the things he hated the most was megaphones. The loud ringing in his ears felt irritating and unpleasant. As such, he did not hesitate to reply. "It's obvious, isn't it? I'm here to trample some insects. As for who I am, there's no need for the dead to know." It was a bold declaration for someone currently being surrounded by more than 100 armed men. Not to mention that more of them were coming and gathering to this place to kill the intruder. Nonetheless, the rebels could not make themselves laugh and ridicule the person that threatened them. It was because there were already several people that fell just a few seconds after the confrontation began. And none of them could prevent it from happening. They could not take this intruder lightly, even if they wanted to. "You." Renz furrowed his eyebrows and stared at Mark ferociously. "Tisk. Kill him." The command was given, and the mutators surrounding Mark fell back at the same time. Then, from more than 100 guns pointed at Mark, bullets rained with a loud uproar. Immediately, Mark ran forwards, avoiding the gunshots. He could not stay at that spot since it would cause a lot of bullets to fly into the warehouse. That would be a dangerous thing that Mark would not let happen. As he ran, Mark's first target was the mutator in front. Why? Within the rebels in the surroundings, there were about 30 mutators. 15 of them were among the ones that surrounded Mark. Compared to the others, the one in front was a burly man with quite slow movements. However, his bright green-colored skin gave Mark a bad feeling. This man was most likely had the ability to use poison and must be eliminated first. Mark stretched his hand forwards, causing the mutator to look confused as he retreated. After all, he was far from Mark's reach at all. But then, the green-skinned mutator's eye dilated when he saw a black spark of electricity on Mark's hand. Roar! With a thundering roar, a whip of black lightning tore through the mutator's body and the ranks of rebels that stood behind him. Dozens of rebels fell as life was snuffed out of their bodies instantly, while more fell incapacitated, violently convulsing with their mouths foaming. The whole place fell silent with extreme horror grasping their hearts. They could not comprehend what happened immediately. The rebels understood one thing, however. The person they were dealing with this time might not be a human but a monster. The rebels started to step back. Their courage to fight suddenly waned. Being able to move fast and kill people with a few waves of his hand was still considered normal since the apocalypse started. But that black lightning that shot from the intruder's hand and killed many of their comrades, it could be anything but normal. Among all kinds of fear, the fear of the unknown was the most horrifying. And now, something they could not fathom stood before them. Monster! A rebel cried out as he threw away his gun and ran for his life. With one starting it, the others followed suit. In the least, not all of them were stupid to let go of their weapons before running with their tails between their legs. The rebels were already in chaos, and the chain of command collapsed. Aside from Renz, only a small portion of the rebels stood their ground. "Stupid idiots! Don't run away!" Renz yelled in his megaphone. Unfortunately, barely anyone listened to his shout. And there, Renz raised the machine gun dangling on his body. Then, he fired. Not at Mark, but at his fleeing subordinates. With a few rounds of indiscriminate firing, some of the rebels fell either dead or injured. This caused the majority to be frozen in their steps. "Fight or I will be the ones killing you all." The rebels became torn between the fear of Mark and the fear from their combat commander. This scene proved something. While these rebels were competent and experienced in fighting, their minds and hearts were still lacking in resolve. They could efficiently move when they thought that they were still at an advantage. But now that they were all swallowed by fear, their heads stopped working properly. And to say, freezing in their steps was the worst thing to do in front of a fierce enemy. Roar! Another roar of thunder was heard, tearing through the rebels with Renz as the primary target. Killing the head would turn an army into a headless chicken. And the more chaotic it was, the easier it would be to destroy everything. However, Renz was not a commander just for show. The moment he felt the threat, he jumped out of the way, throwing his gun at the trajectory of the black lightning. As the gun was directly hit by the lightning, it bent away from Renz. To be able to move out swiftly and throw a heavy machine gun without problems, Renz himself was not just a regular person either. Renz turned his head to Mark. The former could feel that the latter already locked onto him. Thus, he activated his mutator ability, making his arm and legs covered in gray fur. It was a partial mutation, but it was enough for Renz to get out of the most dangerous situations. Roar! 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 Mark shot black lightning consecutively at the combat commander of the rebels. But like a hard-to-kill insect, Renz managed to avoid it using his subordinates as shields. And as it appeared, not all the rebels lost morale in fighting the intruder. The mutators started to attack Mark using their abilities while snipers began firing from the surrounding watchtowers. Compared to the ones near Mark, the rebels further away were still composed. However, to that overwhelming firepower aimed at him, Mark's response was a satisfied smile. Since the time he absorbed the lightning manipulation mental crystal, and one of the two, speedbone mutation physical crystal, this was the very first time he was able to fully utilize both abilities. Using lightning attacks was the most efficient in dealing with these rebels. Because all of them were holding metal conductors, aka guns, it was easier for the lightning bolts to bounce from target to target. And using the speed he acquired from that mutation, it became easier for him to react to attacks and bullets flying towards him. Accompanied with his emphatic detection, made both abilities utilized even further. Thus, in the middle of these humans, he was like an invincible war god. Without hesitation, Mark eliminated the mutators around him, grabbing some of them and using their bodies as shields against incoming gunfire. After their deaths, he would make sure to decapitate them and store the heads inside his ring. There was no way he would waste resources, after all. Not far from Mark, Renz, who managed to take advantage of the situation and hid, could not believe what he was watching. Their precious mutators were getting slaughtered one by one, and their manpower was losing a huge fraction after every roar of thunder. And yet, the intruder was still unscathed. Just where in the world did this monster came from? Renz glared at Mark with extreme rage. There was their leader that he hated and could not surpass in terms of strength. And now, there was this monster that was demolishing the foundation that he was slowly building. Getting these rebels to follow his commands without question was not easy, and now, the very same people were dying in front of him. What was the most annoying thing was that they seemed to display a similar ability. Hateful, Renz growled. However, despite his rage, his mind was still clear. He was not stupid to charge forwards and commit suicide. Instead, he waited for an opportunity. Luckily for Renz, what he was waiting for did not take long to arrive. Roar! Another roar of thunder echoed across the rebel base. This time, however, it was not a black streak of lightning but a normal-looking one. Furthermore, it was not a formless attack as the lightning seemed to gather at a single point like a huge ball. And that point was charging at Mark at alarming speeds. Bam! Mark and that ball of lightning clashed, creating bolts of both black and yellow lightning to scatter into the surroundings. Stretching his right arm forwards, Mark looked at the enemy whose fist met his. It was a woman in her early 30s with flowing golden hair and a body clad in bright surges of electricity. Looking at this woman, her appearance definitely fits a certain person. Without a doubt, she was the leader of the aggressive faction of the rebels, Emmeline Aguilera. Bam! Mark and Emmeline had their other fists clash, causing both of them to retreat backward. And to say, Mark did not expect something. It was not a secret that the leader of this faction was a female mutator. But as there was no established level differentiation among mutators, such information was nowhere to be found. But to Mark, he could tell that this woman was already a level 3, and the most surprising was that she was likely to be very close to reaching level 4. While Mark was observing Emmeline, she was doing the same. Unlike Renz, however, it seemed that she had some idea who Mark was. "You must be that courier that arrived yesterday. What is your reason for attacking us?" Mark was not surprised that she knew. After all, there was one person among the rebels that he was quite familiar with. Emmeline's right-hand man, who was called Felix. He was one of the people in the group that General Padilla's secretary, Vanessa, belonged to. Day 148 to 12:19 p.m., Factory Area, Rebels Base, San Pablo Poblacion, Municipality of Viga, Catanduanes. The arrival of their faction leader boosted the remaining rebels' morale. Although they were still keeping a safe distance, they already stopped on their tracks. Aiming their guns at Mark, they were ready to fire at once the order dropped. Furthermore, as time passed, more and more of the rebels arrived to subdue the single intruder present before them. At this point, with Mark at the center, it almost looked like a scene from an old Chinese war movie surrounding the enemy army's general. However, as the situation around him worsened, the more Mark felt satisfied. After all, it was all according to plan. To eliminate the majority of these rebels, Mark would not take too much time. He had an arsenal of abilities that he could use to kill them all, but he was stalling for time instead. Mark ignored the question of Emmeline, and his eyes fell on a person standing at a scaffolding not far behind the rebel leader. According to the descriptions, that man should Felix, the right-hand man of Emmeline. However, Mark was sure that he felt that this guy was with the man that Vanessa spoke to after he delivered the package last night. It was strange considering that Felix was here when he was also present at the military settlement the previous evening. The distance between the Catanduanes military settlement and this base was not small. It was more than 30 kilometers away. The way would be dangerous, and there were mountains between the two places. It would be impossible to traverse that distance in a single night. It was unless they could fly. However, Mark was sure. Felix was not a mutator to be capable of that. Maybe they had other means of doing so. Suddenly, Felix smiled. It seemed that he could tell that Mark was staring at him despite the mask Mark was wearing. Mark could only frown, unable to shake the eerie feeling towards this human. Furthermore, did their group plant their members on every faction on this island? Vanessa was beside General Padilla, and this Felix was here. It was not hard to assume that they also did the same with other factions and organizations. Not paying attention, are we? Emmeline spoke with a cold voice. If you don't want to answer, then die. With a loud shout and a deafening crackle, Emmeline charged towards Mark. With the chirping of 1,000 birds, surging streaks of electricity covered Emmeline's arms, forming a long blade as she swiped at Mark. Crash. The sound of crashing glass echoed as Mark crossed his arms, blocking both blades from reaching both sides of his neck. The impact was not anyone could shrug off as the cemented ground below Mark's feet cracked horribly. After seeing her lightning blades shatter, Emmeline's eyes dilated. She immediately jumped backward with a deep frown on her golden eyebrows. Although she heard about what happened last night from Felix, she never thought it would be like this. The enemy did not even flinch from her attack. Mark, on the other hand, stood on position once more. He was shaking his hand due to numbness. Sure enough, an almost level 4 mutator was seriously on another level. His arm's bones could have shattered if he received this very same attack a few days ago. Of course, since it was Mark, it would not be a problem. His arms would start healing immediately. However, it would still feel horribly painful. Fortunately, he already absorbed those crystals. Still, it was quite surprising. For some reason, Emmeline's mutation gave the same vibe as Colleen's. It was very unique. And if following science, far more impossible compared to other mutator abilities. Colleen's ability were claws that seemed to slice through anything on a molecular level. When she transformed, her hair would turn glowing purple, flowing like it was unaffected by gravity. Emmeline, on the other hand, seemed to be able to solidify lightning, and her transformation also looked a bit similar, with the color of her hair as an exception. Mark raised his head, looking at the leader of this faction of the rebels. Now, he assessed that it would be hard for her to do anything to him, as such. "My turn," Mark said with a playful tone. Emmeline clearly heard that and took a defensive stance. And then, Mark vanished from Emmeline's sight. Emmeline immediately raised her guard, waiting for the incoming attack. But then, With a loud crackle and splatter of blood, Mark was already in the middle of the rebels, killing without mercy. *T. You son of a B***tch, I'm your opponent, Emmeline roared, chasing after Mark. The rebel leader reached Mark's position and released another attack using her blades of solidified lightning. This time, however, Mark did not stop to catch her attack. Mark kicked the ground, moving faster than most people could follow. The lightning blades did not hit anything. Emmeline landed on her feet, immediately looking for the enemy. It was not hard to find Mark, though, as everyone only needed to follow where the cries of death were coming from. The frustrating cat and mouse chase began, with the supposed mouse slaughtering the subordinates of the cat. None of them noticed that Mark was deliberately moving the battle away from the warehouse. Renz watched the spectacle with hate and envy. Both Mark and Emmeline were showing abilities impossible in the realm of humanity. He, on the other hand, only had these fur-covered arms and feet. It did enhance his abilities as a human, but he was too far to be called inhuman. Tisk. Renz clicked his tongue and signaled for his loyal men to gather. Prepare the rockets. Boss, are we doing it now? Renz's right-hand man called Caleb asked. He was that mutator with detection ability. It was a reasonable question. Using rockets inside the base was a risky action, after all. Not to mention that the intruder was currently fighting against their faction leader. They were in the middle of the rebel army. It can't be helped. Renz reasoned. It might be risky, but it's also a good opportunity. After hearing those words, Renz's men began to move. First, they retreated away from the center of the battle as stealthily as possible. While Renz's group retreated, one of his men started to whistle. However, his whistle did not seem to be heard by everyone at all. Instead, it was another division of the rebels on standby that heard it clearly. It was the group that Renz built as his own loyal army. When the base was facing disasters like this group would be on standby at the pretense of being a reinforcement group. They were stationed at the armory to pick up the needed weapons and equipment if something unexpected happened. Of course, it was all the arrangement of Renz for a specific moment. The reinforcement group heard the whistle and began to move. The whistle was a code, telling them what equipment to take and what actions to make. Now, they looked a bit nervous but also determined. Now was the time they were waiting for. Back at the factory area, the rebels started running away once more. The rise of morale they received did not take long and began to crumble. It was because even though they kept firing their guns and their leader continued attacking, the intruder was still alive, killing everyone in his path. Soon, by everyone's surprise, the reinforcement group started to surround the factory area. They positioned themselves on higher grounds, wielding those large rocket launchers. Some were even riding on vehicles, making their presence known. It was hard not to notice it, and most of the rebels became confused instead of feeling relieved. Even Emmeline could not help but stop on her tracks. Deploying rockets this time was not unreasonable. However, some of the men equipped with the rockets were aiming specifically at her and not the enemy. Mark, on the other hand, also stopped. He was interested in the drama that was about to happen. There, they noticed Renz climbing up one of an open military jeep together with his entourage. Renz. You bastard, what is the meaning of this? Emmeline roared. Emmeline. Are you dumb or what? The government calls us rebels. So what do you think are we doing? Renz arrogantly replied. Renz. You, of course. Emmeline was furious. If glares could kill, the person she was staring at had already died hundreds of times. Me what? Renz returned the glare in kind. Stop glaring to B***tch. The only thing you have is that monstrous strength. Without me, you can't even manage the faction. And yet, because everyone is afraid of you, you took the position of the leader. Renz then exaggeratedly pointed at his chest. For years, I've been the brains of this faction. When the faction leader died because of his infected wife, I should have been the one following in line. Yet, UF*C King took it away. Renz then pointed at Emmeline. You started enforcing rules. Laws that we should follow, or else you will end up killing us. You know that, right? We are fighting the government because we are sick of their laws. Their laws that did not even take the populace into account, with those crocodiles fattening up their already overflowing wallets. At this point, Renz sat down on the backrest of the seat beside the driver's seat. The world already crumbled. Even the government did not have any hold on their laws now. And yet, there's you. A faction leader of the rebels enforcing the very same rules. Are you the government now? Then, we must destroy you, right? Aren't you afraid of me? Emmeline replied. I can't believe that you actually had the guts to rebel. Yeah. I am afraid of you, ha ha ha. Renz laughed maniacally. You are strong. All of us are afraid. That is why we can't understand. Why are you standing up for the weak? It's the end of the world. The strong eat the weak. It's the survival of the fittest. But the rules you impose favored the weak instead. How dumb. If I had your power, I could have ruled this island now. In the end, you are just some naive woman. Renz then raised his hand. His loyal men put their fingers on the trigger of their rocket launchers. Boss Renz. We are still here. One of the rebels at the center of the factory yelled out in fear. Although many of them started to run away, a lot of them were still left near the area where Mark and Emmeline stood. Even if the target of rockets were Mark and Emmeline, many rebels would still be caught in the explosion. Become noble sacrifices. Renz sneered. Don't worry, we will take care of your families, if there's any left. Renz's eyes turned away from the despairing rebels back to Emmeline and Mark. Goodbye, Emmeline. And to you too, you monster. There. Renz dropped his arm forwards, signaling the execution. With hundreds of loud sounds, hundreds of rockets flew from different directions. Horror and despair. The rebels at the center of the factory area desperately ran away. However, rocket launchers were not perfectly accurate weapons. Some of the rockets could deviate from the targets due to various reasons. With loud sounds, flowers of explosions bloomed. Many feeling rebels died immediately, with more severely injured, losing their limbs or other parts of their bodies. As for Emmeline and Mark, their location was bombarded by the majority of the rockets. More than 100 rockets might appear to be overkill, but Renz thought otherwise. The two were monsters. If not for the fact that the numbers of rocket launchers they had were limited, he could have deployed more. But seeing the explosion and feeling the shockwave on his face, Renz was confident that it should be enough. Ha ha ha. FCKING finally. Renz laughed hysterically. But then, a playful voice sounded. How stupid. Renz looked at the source of the voice. It was no other than Felix, that was seemingly enjoying the show. You lowly dog. Your master is gone now. Do you think you can still be smug about it? Renz ridiculed Felix. However, the usurper was only replied with a sneer as the latter pointed at the place where the rockets exploded. That was when they realized the smoke appeared to be dissipating faster than they expected. And there, they saw someone step out of the smoke. It was Emmeline, with crystallized ice hair and armor made of ice. Day 148 to 12:25 p.m. Factory area, Rebel Base, San Pablo Poblacion, Municipality of Viga, Catanduanes. Smoke screened, obscuring everyone's sight. Intense heat surged across the place. Blood painted the scorched ground. Dismembered body parts littered the surroundings. In the middle of it all, Emmeline stood. Emmeline's golden hair was now clear blue like icicles. Instead of surges of electricity, thick ice armor covered her body. Renz and his men stared at Emmeline in utter shock. Even the surviving rebels were surprised to see their leader still alive from that devastating explosion. It seemed that no one here, aside from Felix, knew about Emmeline having this ability. As it appeared, she hid it well. How is this possible? Even if Renz did not want to, only those words could come out of his mouth. Wow, surprised Pikachu face. Another voice echoed. Those that heard that voice could not help but turn and saw Mark sitting on a scaffolding not far from Felix. This scene poured another bucket of icy water on Renz and his men. It was unbelievable that both the targets engulfed by the explosions of hundreds of rockets were still alive. Renz! Emmeline roared in a burst of fury. The surroundings felt colder and colder. Renz could not help but flinch. Fire! Fire! Renz yelled in fear. Rocket launchers were not easy to reload, especially for people lacking experience. The only thing that the rebels could fire was their guns. And by Renz's order, more than 100 people caused a war-like rain of bullets to the rebel leader. The deafening sound of gunshots echoed throughout the rebel base. In response to that, however, Emmeline punched the ground with both her ice-covered fist. Creak! Crash! With glass-like sounds, walls of ice rose around her. No bullet managed to reach her at all because of the walls of ice. Furthermore, the bullets could barely leave a crack on the walls, showing how resilient the walls of ice were. More and more bullets buffeted the walls of ice, cracks accumulated here and there, but there was not a single sign of it shattering. How long was it? A few seconds, or maybe a few minutes? The continuous gunfire did not last long and died down. The ammunition of every single rebel was limited after all. Yet, the walls of ice stood still. Renz! Emmeline's roar was heard once more, causing the cowardly Renz to panic. Crack! One portion of the walls shattered, revealing Emmeline that destroyed it with her own fist. Slowly, she walked forwards. At the same time, a meter-long icicle started to form on her right hand. Die! Emmeline shouted, throwing the icicle at Renz. The icicle flew at the speed of a cannon, with the sound of the wind being ripped apart. On the other side, Renz's eyes dilated as he tried to evade. He jumped out of the jeep as fast as he could, and he managed to succeed. After all, speed was his forte aside from his brain. Unfortunately, Renz's men were not as fast as him. The time they saw Renz leave the jeep, the icicle was already in front of them. Bang! The icicle tore through the vehicle, causing the jeep that carried weapons and explosives to burst into flames. Boom! The jeep then exploded. It caused Renz, that was still in the radius of the explosion, to get blown away. Lifting his injured body, Renz stared at the flames as they consumed his closest henchman. But of course, it was not the end. Creaking glass sounds could be heard as Emmeline continued to move. The rebels that went to antagonize their leader could not help but retreat in fear, firing their guns as much as they could. That was when it sunk into their minds. The ice armor that Emmeline was wearing was far stronger than those walls she conjured. The bullets could not even leave a scratch on the armor. It was not surprising considering how it managed to protect her from dozens of rockets. The impact of the bullets made Emmeline freeze for a bit, but it did not stop her from advancing. Ahhhh! Some of the rebels gave out their cry of death, as Emmeline threw another huge icicle, with an impact that tore their bodies apart. Before, it was Mark. Now, it was Emmeline that was conducting the slaughter of the rebels. Sitting atop the scaffolding, Mark watched Emmeline do his work. It was unexpected, but this situation was definitely in his favor. Furthermore, the only reason he was dallying here was to ensure that the majority of the rebels moved to this area. With Renz calling unto the reinforcement group to deal with their own leader, the condition for the next phase was met. Mark then took out a flare gun from his belt and fired to the sky. With the flare in the sky, the second phase finally started. Bang! 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 Suddenly, the snipers on the watchtowers fell one after another. With the ongoing commotion below, however, no one managed to notice. At the same time, another commotion began at the west side of the base. On this side, the farming area was located. While the captured females were in the factory, the men incapable of fighting were sent here to farm. They were also having their lunch break when the commotion in the factory area started. Knowing that the women were there, to whom many of them were related, a lot of them panicked. They wanted to rush there to check the safety of their loved ones. But of course, the guards that the rebels posted in this area prevented them from doing so. One man tried to force the guards to let them check on their relatives, only to get bashed by one of the guards with the stock of his assault rifle. As much worried as they could not do anything. The explosions shook their hearts, even more, fearing for the lives of the women in the factory area. It was when they saw the flare shot towards the sky. It was noontime, and its light was not visible. However, it would be hard to miss something that was literally shot above them. That was when they saw a dragon flew up to the sky, from the forest west of the farming area. Everyone was horrified, whether it be the workers or the guards. The workers ran away like ants, trying to go into the base to escape. However, during working hours, the gate was locked down. They could only knock on the gates frantically with none opening it from the other side. At the side, the guards did the same instead of fighting the monster that popped out of nowhere. Yes, they could have used their guns and shoot. However, their current numbers were too low, with most of them joining the commotion at the factory area. Shooting the dragon could only draw its attention to them. Their lives were more important than these slaves working in the field. Some of the men fell on their knees. With the gates closed, they could only pray for their lives. They wished that the dragon would just fly over them, attracted to the loud explosions in the factory area. That was where they were wrong, as the dragon landed in the middle of the fields. Without a choice, the guards readied themselves to fire their weapons. Bang! Bang! And the first shots echoed in everyone's ears. Unexpectedly, it was not from the rebels. In fact, it was the rebels who were hit by the bullets. That was when the people on the ground realized there were people riding on the dragon's back. Two men wearing armor jumped off from the dragon's back and started shouting to the terrified workers. "Don't panic. We are here to free you all." "What? Free us?" The workers were flabbergasted to the sudden development. "Hurry, kill them." Shouts broke the confusion as the guards took action. But then, the guards were suddenly faced with an unexpected adversary. Yes, it was totally unexpected. It was because a little girl with white hair and cat ears appeared before them. Their surprise and confusion became their weakness as the girl's figure blurred. The next thing they knew was their necks being snapped backward in an impossible angle before they fell, lifeless. The same was happening to the other groups of guards, as a girl with a burning barrier, a girl with incredible strength, and a girl with vines as hair confronted them all. Seeing how the guards were being subdued one after another, the situation finally sunk into the minds of the workers. It was time to rise against their captors. Some of the men rushed to the dead guards, picking up their weapons and equipment. They already forgot the fear they felt when they saw the dragon land before them. It did not take long. The guards at the farming area were all either killed or subdued. "Why-ya!" The men roared in vigor, seeing the rebels that captured and separated them from their loved ones finally receiving their just desserts. "Take down the bastards, inside the base, go." Finally having the chance for freedom, the men could not wait and wanted to fight the rebels. They wanted to reunite with their relatives and friends in the factory area as soon as possible. Especially now that there seemed to be a threatening event happening there. But then, unexpected, the dragon flew up and landed before the gates, preventing anyone from breaking it or passing through. What are you doing? You two said that you are here to free us. Why are you blocking our path?" The men were clearly afraid of Chaflar, but their longing to save their loved ones took over their fear. As such, the workers questioned the two men that declared to help them earlier. On Chaflar's back, Padua and Geronimo looked at each other and nodded. "Unfortunately, we can't let you all pass," Padua declared. "Our leader is already there to save the women in the factory area. I'm sure that you all can hear the explosions. It's likely caused by the rebels fighting our leader." Then, we wanted to help. Those are our relatives." One of the workers cried out. It was when a man with pointy ears and was holding a spear appeared beside Chaflar, dragging the body of a dead rebel that hid nearby. "Help, you say?" Pephile arrogantly said. "With your thin arms and a hungry stomach, what help can you give? If all of you go there, you all will only drag our leader down. What can any of you do there aside from dying?" The workers that spoke just now was at a loss of what to say. It was true, after all. They might have been able to subdue the guards here because there was a lesser number left because of the commotion in the factory area. Once they entered the base, however, they would probably have to face a larger number of rebels. With their bodies that were out of shape, they would be of no help, after all. "Why your leader?" One younger worker spoke out. "Can he really save my mother?" That question was asked to Padua and Geronimo. As the two were only new members, they did not know what to answer. They could only turn to Pephile. As everyone's eyes fell back on Pephile, he shrugged. "Can't you all tell? Those explosions and gunshots. The rebels should be having a hard time." Hearing that, the workers were still not at ease. However, their agitation died down slowly. For the rebels to be worked up to use explosives in their own base, the ones the rebels were fighting might be strong people. "Please, just wait here," Geronimo spoke out. "Our duty here is to save and protect you all. We can't let you all enter since we won't be able to protect any of you if you all did." Compared to Padua and Pephile, Geronimo was more amicable while talking. It made the workers feel more at ease. "Are you from the military?" one of the workers asked. Geronimo hesitated to answer. It was Padua that did. "We are not." "Then why are you people helping us?" The question arose. After all, there was a very high chance that there were ulterior motives to this. And then, both Padua and Geronimo looked at each other once more. Then, they both looked at Pephile. "Don't look at me. I don't know either." Everyone was speechless. Apparently, they were sent to help these people without knowing why. Day 148 to 12:28 p.m. Factory area, Rebel Base, San Pablo Poblacion, Municipality of Viga, Catanduanes. Emilium had already gone on a bloody rampage, killing her former subordinates, those that took the courage to revolt against her rule. Knowing that they had no other choice to take, the rebels started to fight back. There was no going back when they chose to follow Renz and his plans. Emmeline was not an unreasonable person. Her rules were all within reason of moral standards. The problem, however, was how she handled punishments. An honest mistake might be forgiven, but intentional ones were immediately given capital punishment. Their leader killing their members for their mistakes was not an unfamiliar scene in this base. In truth, some of the members even started to get used to it. And that was what Renz and those that sided with him could not accept. After all, they did not want to be bound to such strict rules. Now that they blatantly went against her, there would be no future for them unless they killed this monster of a woman. Rat-a-tat-a-tat-a. Gunshots coming from different calibers of guns continued echoing non-stop. However, their efforts were never enough to take down the enraged Emmeline. Emmeline continued to throw her conjured icicles as she traversed the field. One of the icicles tore a rebel's leg. He was still alive, but he was already out of commission to continue fighting. While screaming in pain, he did not notice that Emmeline was already in front of him until she picked him up. Miss Emellyn, leader, F forgive me, P please spa. Splurt. Blood splattered, dyeing Emmeline's ice armor in red. Without mercy, she tore the rebel's body into two with her ice-covered hands. Emmeline turned to the other rebels that followed Renz's orders. The sight of her bloodthirsty eyes and body tainted with blood was enough to give them nightmares. "Fire! Fire!" Renz ordered as he picked up an assault rifle lying nearby and started firing at Emmeline. But of course, the bullets he fired did not do anything to their faction leader at all. Instead, an icicle came flying towards his direction that he frantically evaded. Whew! Mark could not help but whistle, seeing how Emmeline was brutally killing her former men. There was no remorse or hesitation. There was only pure burning rage from the bottom of her heart. Nevertheless, Mark was not surprised. Mutators had mental traits, after all. And Emmeline's mutator trait was revenge. The urge to make Renz and his men pay for their sins fueled Emmeline's rage to an unbelievable degree. Mark could tell that even if he tried to use his emotion induction to Emmeline and try to convert her fury into something else, nothing would happen. Emmeline's killing intent was already off the charts and was still increasing at this moment. Revenge, huh? Mark murmured. I'm surprised. How can you tell? Suddenly, a voice asked Mark. It was no other than Felix that was sitting not far from Mark. Mark turned to Felix, but instead of replying, he took the opportunity to observe him. Felix appeared to be a young man in his mid-20s. His fringed-up hair was ash-colored that looked natural despite not being a mutator. It was also impossible that he was an albino since, aside from his hair, he looked like a regular person. There was also his eyes that had red pupils. Mark could not help but think that Felix was some sort of demon. However, it felt that it was not the case. This man had no demonic aura at all. There were no traces of him emitting magical power either. Felix let out an interesting smile, sensing that Mark was sizing him up. However, he did not say anything about it. Instead, he turned his eyes back at Emmeline and started to speak. Miss Emmeline is such a pitiful woman, isn't she? Pitiful? What the hell is this guy talking about? Mark could not help but think. Establishing power is the least of her goals. However, to actually fulfill her goals, she needed to establish power first. But despite what she looked like, she valued her position as it didn't only protect innocent people in this place, but she was also holding unto the goals of the people following her sincerely. Felix then shrugged. She must be distraught now, seeing that the people following her are now dead bodies scattered around her. Mark finally understood. This guy was explaining what was happening to Emmeline right now. No wonder that woman was getting increasingly furious as time went on. The more she saw the bodies scattered around her, her urge to seek revenge accumulated deeper. Do you want to know why Miss Emmeline became a member of the rebels? Felix asked Mark. Like before, Mark did not reply. However, Felix still continued. Miss Emmeline did not share the same visions of the leaders of the NPA before the outbreak. Establishing a new government. Miss Emmeline did not care for any of that. What she wanted is to get revenge on the current government. A long time ago, there was a family living in the mountains of Katandwanas. It was a family of 4. A father, a mother, their son, and the youngest, their daughter. Yes, it was far from civilization. It was literally at the foot of the mountains, after all. However, life was good. Their family was able to use their surroundings, farming vegetables and fishing at the river flowing near their house. They also managed to rear a few pigs that they could sell from time to time. Selling vegetables and freshwater shrimps to the nearest barangay that was about 2 hours away gave funds to their necessities. Entertainment was not an issue as people living a simple life like this was not hungry for such luxuries. But of course, the parents had better dreams for their children. But unfortunately, their poor family could not afford to give the son proper education and only finished high school. Because of that, they focused on the education of the daughter. Putting all their extra income into savings, they managed to enroll the daughter into a university, with a course in agriculture. It was chosen by the daughter in order to help her parents in the future. Because there were no colleges nearby, the daughter had to go to Virac, Katandwanas to study. It was too far from the mountain where they live and the daughter had to live in a boarding house. Her studies were going smoothly and she was even a candidate for a spot of the magna cum laude. It was just half a year left and she would finish her studies. She could not wait to bring the magnificent news to her parents and brother. But before she managed to send the magnificent news about her family came to her first. While eating in a cafeteria outside her school, a piece of certain news on the television took her attention as it happened in the area where her family lived. It seemed that there was an encounter between the military and the NPA, and as the military reported, they managed to kill the group and identify the culprits. Furthermore, the military was being praised for managing to eliminate the threat in the area, with some of the soldiers receiving medals. Apparently, it was a huge encounter with a group of rebels that were ambushing the military convoys in the area. And then, the list of casualties was shown on the local news channel. The eyes of the daughter dilated as she saw that among the list of dead rebels, her father, mother, and brother were included. It was impossible to happen. She collapsed after seeing that news. As soon as she recovered, she did not care whether she had classes or not. She did not even tell the school about anything. Instead, she rushed home, traveling almost overnight. The next morning, tired and sleepy, she reached her home at the foot of the mountains, only to see it being cordoned by the military. Rushing towards her house, she was immediately stopped by the soldiers. They immediately recognized her as a college student since she was still wearing her school uniform. But when she yelled that it was her family's house, the expression of the soldiers changed. Their faces did not show vigilance, but instead, pity. She was still not allowed to enter her house, but she was instead brought to where the corpses of her family were being kept. Crying, she shouted and yelled to the soldiers. She asked what in the world happened. She explained that it was impossible for her family to be members of the rebels. The soldiers did not explain anything. They just looked at her with distraught expressions. She was broken at her loss. She did not know what to do and what to expect of the future without her family. She did not know what in the world happened, and no one was explaining anything to her. The only thing that the military said to her was that the military would take over the expenses of the funeral and burial of her family. That itself was really odd. The funeral came. It was an empty room with only her sitting in front of 3 caskets. After all, they had no known relatives, and who would come to the funeral of people branded as rebels. At the funeral, a lawyer from the military approached her. It was not to talk about laws and stuff, but instead, she was given an envelope. Her eyes are empty. She did not even eat properly during the duration of the funeral. It was only by reflex that she received the envelope, not even understanding anything of what the lawyer was saying. She opened the envelope while the lawyer continued to talk. That was when she saw several checks, with a value totaling 500,000 Philippine pesos. She was also being urged to sign some paper packed with words that she could not bother to read. That was when it clicked into her mind. Hush money. She was being paid to keep silent about what happened to her family. Many assumptions started to flood her mind, and anger began to show on her face. Without a second thought, she tore the envelope and its contents, snatched the contract, and slapped it on the lawyer's face. She then ran away. The girl did not know how long she had been running, but she ended up deep into a forest she was not familiar with. That was when she met a strange man with ash-colored hair. To her surprise, the man told her the truth about what happened up to the tiniest detail that made it hard to say that he was lying. He even described her family as if he knew them personally. And there, the daughter learned that her family was shot to death by a deranged soldier that did not follow the orders from their superior. The soldier was also injured, shot by one of the rebels on his leg. Losing blood, the soldier started to lose the capability to think straight. The soldier thought that the hut at the foot of the mountain was an outpost of the rebels. After all, who would build a house in such a desolate area? And then, he fired indiscriminately. There was no way that a wall made of nipa palm would stop bullets. Thus, the family that was hiding inside because of the gunshots from the encounter were killed on the spot. Of course, the military knew this mistake but decided to cover it up. Apparently, the order came up from above, the government. After all, there were no witnesses, and the military and the government would not want to face another backlash. And there, the daughter swore vengeance against the government. She promised herself to kill everyone involved in the death of her family, whether it be the military, the government, or the rebels. That was how the current Emmeline was born.